Title: The Vber Driver. Chapter 1: A Night to Forget. The rain drizzled against the city pavement, reflecting neon lights from the signs above. Madison Carter, mid-30s, sharp-featured with jet-black hair and piercing green eyes, stumbled out of a dimly lit bar in downtown Seattle. Her black dress clung to her damp skin, her high heels clicking against the uneven pavement. She swayed slightly. Too many martinis, maybe? Or maybe it was the ghost of a memory clawing its way into her consciousness. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she fumbled with her phone, squinting at the Vber app. Her vision blurred. Shit! She tapped for a ride, barely registering the driver's name. Madison wasn't used to feeling this out of control. She was a litigation consultant, sharp-witted, and always composed. Yet tonight, her mind felt like a fractured mirror, reflecting fragments of things she didn't want to remember. Within minutes, a black sedan pulled up in front of her. The license plate matched the one on her cell phone screen.
Madison?
The driver asked in a deep, familiar voice. She barely glanced at him as she slid into the back seat.
Yeah, just drive.
The car pulled into traffic, tires slicing through rain puddles. Silence filled the space between them, thick and suffocating. She rubbed her temples. Had she done something bad tonight? Something unfixable? Then she noticed the little details. The way the rearview mirror tilted just enough so the driver could watch her. The way his hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, like he was bracing for something. And then he hummed, a deep, eerie tune that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Her stomach dropped. She had heard that tune before. Chapter 2: 7 Years of Silence. 10 years ago, Madison had made a choice. One that ruined a man's life. Eric Calloway had been nobody to her. A local mechanic who worked part-time as a Vber driver. Slightly older, broad-shouldered, and with dark, brooding eyes. He had the kind of presence that made people uneasy. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was quiet, observant. Madison had met Eric Calloway only once. Just one fleeting encounter at a house party. The gathering had been thrown by her best friend, Lacey. An event teeming with young professionals, cheap wine, and the kind of forced laughter that came with networking. Dressed in a figure-hugging emerald dress, Madison had been the center of attention, reveling in the envious glances of other women and the admiration of men. Among them was Eric, broad-shouldered, with dark, brooding eyes and calloused hands that betrayed his blue-collar work. He had been charming in a quiet, unpolished way, his smirk slow but confident. She had barely noticed him until he made the mistake of catching her ex-boyfriend Derek's attention. Derek was over at the bar waiting for a drink. Derek had always been possessive, his temper short-fused and his ego fragile. When he saw Eric smiling at her, something dark flickered in his gaze, but he still needed his drink. Eric had approached Madison, a harmless flirtation at first.
Eric, and you look like you belong somewhere fancier than this.
His voice was deep, rich, laced with amusement. Madison had laughed, partly flattered, partly wary. Madison, and you look like you don't belong here at all. Eric smirked.
Well, you got me there. A guy like me doesn't usually get invited to swanky little soirees like this. You see that guy over there?
He tilted his head toward a broad-shouldered man at the bar, clearly already a few drinks deep.
That's my buddy Luis. He's the one who dragged me here, said I needed to expand my social horizons. Apparently, turning wrenches and driving drunks around town doesn't count as socializing.
Madison raised an eyebrow.
So, you're a mechanic and a Vber driver?
What can I say? I'm a man of many talents.
Eric said, leaning in just enough that his cologne mixed with the scent of bourbon in her glass.
You know, fixing cars, dodging bad pickup lines, making small talk with people way out of my tax bracket, it's a skill set. She rolled her eyes but smiled despite herself.
And what exactly does a man like you talk about when socializing with people like me?
Oh, you know,
He sipped his drink, watching her over the rim.
the finer things in life. Like why a woman as gorgeous as you is here with a man who keeps glaring at us like I just stole his credit card.
Madison followed his gaze toward Derek, who was gripping his whiskey glass like it personally offended him. She sighed.
That would be my boyfriend.
Ah,
Eric nodded knowingly.
the extremely jealous type.
The extremely exhausting type.
She corrected, swirling her drink.
Let's just say, I don't know if I see things lasting long term.
Eric chuckled.
So what you're saying is, I have a shot.
Madison scoffed, but the playful gleam in her eye gave her away.
Oh, you're smooth.
I prefer confidently opportunistic.
He replied, grinning.
But you didn't answer the question.
Madison took a slow sip of her bourbon, as if it were martini, letting the silence stretch.
That depends.
On?
Eric leaned closer.
How good you are at dirty talk.
Eric nearly choked on his drink, but he recovered quickly, shaking his head with a laugh.
Oh, sweetheart, if that's the game you want to play, you'd better buckle up.
She smirked.
You, a dirty talker? Prove it.
Eric tilted his head, his grin devilish.
Well, let's see. You like cars, Madison?
She shrugged.
I mean, I appreciate a nice ride.
Good, because if I had you in my passenger seat, I'd make sure you never wanted to get out.
He murmured, his voice low and inviting.
I'd take you on the smoothest ride of your life. Top speed, no brakes. Just you, me, and the open road.
Madison bit her lip, pretending to be unimpressed.
Not bad, but I don't know if you can handle a woman like me.
Eric leaned back with a smirk.
Oh, I can handle anything with the right tools. And trust me, I come fully equipped.
Madison laughed, shaking her head.
All right, you win this round.
Oh, honey,
Eric said with a wink.
we're just getting started.
Their laughter mixed with the hum of the lights, and for a moment, Madison forgot about Derek's jealous eyes boring into the back of her head. There was something about Eric, his easy confidence, his wicked sense of humor that made her feel weightless. And maybe, just maybe, that was what made him dangerous. Derek had appeared beside her then, his hand clamping possessively around her wrist.
Who the hell are you?
He snapped at Eric, his eyes flashing with territorial rage.
Eric had lifted his hands in surrender. Relax, man. Just making conversation.
Madison had felt Derek's grip tighten, his fingers digging into her skin. The night had soured after that. Eric walked away, but it didn't end there. Hours later, as the party wound down, Madison had wandered onto the balcony to escape Derek's suffocating presence. The air was cool, crisp, refreshing against her flushed skin. She hadn't expected Eric to be there leaning against the railing, gazing out at the city lights.
Escaping? He had asked, his voice soft. knowing.
She sighed.
Something like that?
They talked, the conversation meandering from idle small talk to something deeper. He made her laugh, made her forget about Derek for a moment. And then, before she could think twice, she kissed him. It was brief, impulsive. But Derek had seen. Rage twisted his features as he stormed toward them.
What the hell are you doing?
He bellowed, shoving Eric back.
Derek, stop.
Madison had protested, trying to grab his arm, but he yanked away from her. Eric had held his hands up again, the same calm demeanor. But Derek wouldn't listen.
You're nothing.
Derek spat at Eric.
Some dirtbag Vber driver thinking he can mess with my girl?
I don't belong to you, Derek.
Madison snapped, her own anger rising. Derek had stared at her, stunned. Then his face darkened.
Oh, so you're just a slut now, jumping on some random guy?
Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She didn't want to continue this fight. She was exhausted, drained from Derek's constant accusations, and she just wanted to leave. She turned to Eric.
Would you mind taking me home? I don't want to deal with this anymore.
Eric hesitated, glancing between her and Derek, but then he nodded.
Yeah, let's get you out of here.
They left together, stepping into the cool night. Eric led her to his car, an older model sedan with a clean interior. The drive was quiet at first, the tension from the party still lingering between them. Finally, Eric broke the silence.
You okay?
He asked, glancing over at her. Madison exhaled, leaning her head against the window.
I don't know. I just hate the way he treats me.
Eric nodded, gripping the steering wheel.
You don't have to put up with it. You know that, right?
She scoffed.
Easier said than done.
They pulled up outside her apartment building. Eric parked, looking at her with quiet concern.
You gonna be okay?
She forced a small smile.
Yeah. Thanks for the ride, Eric.
She stepped out of the car, smoothing down her dress, and as she shut the door, she caught sight of Derek. He was standing outside the apartment complex, arms crossed, eyes burning with fury as he watched her emerge from Eric's car. Her stomach twisted. She knew what was coming before she even walked through the door. Inside, Derek was waiting. The fight resumed instantly, his voice sharp, filled with venom.
So that's it? You leave with him just like that?
I needed to get away from you, Derek. You were being insane.
Insane?
He let out a bitter laugh.
No, Madison, I just see you for what you really are. A lying, cheating whore. I can't live with that. I'm done. I'm leaving.
Something inside Madison snapped. She couldn't let him leave, couldn't let him walk away with the upper hand, making her feel small. And so, without even thinking, the words came tumbling from her lips.
He forced himself on me.
She whispered, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. Derek froze.
What?
Eric,
She said, her eyes wide with feigned terror.
I tried to pull away. I told him no. He wouldn't stop. He forced me into his car.
Derek's anger had twisted into something else then, something cold, vengeful.
That son of a bitch.
Madison saw the wheels turning in his mind, saw the fire in his eyes, and she knew what she had done. Derek paced, his fists clenching and unclenching.
We need to call the cops.
He said, his voice shaking with fury. Madison hesitated.
No,
She whispered.
I can't. I just want to forget it happened.
Forget it?
Derek's voice rose.
Madison, he raped you. We have to report this.
She played her part well, hugging herself, letting out a shaky breath.
I'm scared, Derek. What if they don't believe me? What if they blame me?
Derek softened slightly, stepping closer.
I won't let that happen. I'll go with you.
Madison bit her lip, her mind racing. She hadn't expected him to push for this. If she resisted too much, he'd start questioning her story. She nodded slowly.
Okay, I'll go.
Derek grabbed his car keys,
I'll drive you.
but Madison shook her head.
Number, I need to do this alone. Please.
Derek hesitated, then relented.
Fine. But you call me the second you're done.
Still shaking, still playing the part of the terrified victim, Madison walked out of her apartment and into the night, her thoughts racing. Derek was furious. What if he went after Eric himself? What if he called the police? She had to take control of the narrative. Chapter 3. The Police Station. She found herself outside the police station, her breath hitching. There was no turning back now. Inside, the station smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. The officer behind the front desk looked up as Madison stepped inside, her eyes red, her breath hitching. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked, concern flickering across his features. Madison swallowed, forcing herself to tremble.
I need to report something. I was raped.
The words sent a ripple of reaction through the room. The officer's demeanor changed instantly. His posture straightened, his expression hardening with professional seriousness. "Come with me," he said, leading her to a private room with beige walls and a simple wooden table. Another officer, a woman this time, entered a few minutes later with a notepad. The door clicked shut behind her. "Can you tell us what happened?" the female officer asked, her voice measured, careful not to push too hard. Madison wrapped her arms around herself, inhaling shakily.
His name is Eric Calloway.
She whispered.
He forced me into his car after the party. I told him no, but he wouldn't stop. He took me to his place. I tried to fight back, but he was too strong.
The officers exchanged glances. It was subtle, but Madison caught it, something unspoken passing between them. "Do you need medical attention?" the female officer asked. "We can arrange for an exam at the hospital. It would help with the investigation." Madison shook her head quickly.
No, I can't. I just want to go home.
The officers hesitated. The male officer leaned forward. "Madison, we understand this is difficult, but a rape kit could provide evidence, DNA, bruising, anything that can support your case." Her heart pounded. She had to think fast.
I showered.
She said suddenly, her voice cracking.
After it happened, I needed to get clean. There's nothing left to find.
Another exchanged glance between the officers. "Okay," the female officer finally said. "But we still need to document everything. If you don't want to go to the hospital, we'll take photographs here of any injuries you might have." Madison stiffened. She hadn't accounted for this.
There aren't any bruises,
she admitted. The officer's expressions didn't shift, but their silence weighed on her. The male officer tapped his pen against the desk. "You fought back, you said?" She nodded quickly.
Yes.
"And he was strong enough to restrain you?"
Yes.
"But no bruises? No scratches on him? Nothing?" Madison's hands clenched in her lap.
I don't know.
She murmured.
I want to forget it happened. Please, I don't want to think about it anymore.
The female officer offered her a reassuring nod. We understand. But Madison, you need to know that cases without physical evidence are harder to prosecute. It doesn't mean we won't investigate.
I know what happened.
Madison burst out, her voice rising.
Just because there's no bruises or DNA doesn't mean it didn't happen.
The room fell into heavy silence. The male officer sighed, rubbing his temple. You're right. We're not doubting you. We'll take your statement and go from there. Madison exhaled, watching as they wrote down every word she said. She knew the statistics. Most rape cases without physical evidence didn't make it far. But that didn't matter. She had planted the seed. And sometimes a word was all it took to destroy someone. The machine of justice began turning. No evidence, no bruises, no DNA, just her word against his. And yet that was enough. Chapter 4. The Arrest of Eric Calloway. It happened 2 days later. Eric was in the middle of replacing a transmission at the auto shop where he worked when the police arrived. The sound of wrenches clanking against metal filled the garage, the scent of oil and grease heavy in the air. Eric Calloway? A firm voice rang out over the noise. Eric turned, wiping his hands on a rag, surprised to see 2 uniformed officers stepping toward him.
Yeah, that's me,
He said, narrowing his eyes.
What's this about?
You're under arrest for sexual assault and rape, the lead officer said, his voice emotionless as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Eric felt the ground shift beneath him.
What? No, there's gotta be a mistake.
But the officers didn't hesitate. They grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back as they secured the cuffs around his wrists. His co-workers stood frozen, watching in stunned silence. You have the right to remain silent. The officer continued, reciting the Miranda rights. Eric's mind raced. Madison. She was the first female he had talked to in that manner in over 4 months. This had to be about her. But why? He had driven her home, watched her walk safely into her building. There had been no struggle, no force, just a ride. A brief moment of understanding between 2 people. His heart pounded in his chest as the officers tightened the cuffs. Panic rose in his throat, but he bit it back.
I didn't do anything,
He said, his voice firm despite the trembling in his limbs.
You're making a mistake.
Tell it to your lawyer, the officer responded coldly, guiding him toward the squad car. The ride to the precinct was silent, but Eric's mind was anything but. Memories of that night flashed through his mind. Every interaction, every word exchanged. It didn't make sense. What was happening? At the precinct, Eric was treated like any other suspect. They took his fingerprints, made him remove his belt and shoelaces, and forced him to stand against a dingy wall as a camera flashed for his mugshot. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting a sickly glow over the bleak surroundings. After hours of waiting, an officer led him into an interrogation room. The walls were a dull, lifeless gray, the air stale with the scent of old coffee and sweat. A single metal table stood in the center. 2 chairs, facing each other. Eric sat, his hands still shaking slightly, staring at the empty chair across from him. The weight of the cuffs, the cold bite of metal against his wrists, reminded him that this was real. He wasn't waking up from this nightmare. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. A detective, middle-aged with sharp eyes and a weary expression, walked in. He carried a file, thick with documents, and dropped it onto the table before sitting down. "Eric Calloway," he said, his voice heavy with skepticism. "Do you know why you're here?" Eric swallowed hard.
I was told I'm being accused of something I didn't do.
The detective leaned forward. "A young woman named Madison Carter has accused you of sexually assaulting her the night of the party. She says you forced her into your car, took her somewhere against her will, and raped her." The words slammed into Eric like a freight train. His stomach twisted.
That's a lie.
He said immediately,
I drove her home. That's all. She asked me to take her because she didn't want to argue with her boyfriend. I never touched her.
The detective studied him for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the file. She gave a detailed statement. She cried during questioning. We asked her multiple times if she was certain, and she stuck to her story. Eric's hands clenched into fists.
Because she's lying.
The detective sighed. Here's the thing, Eric. There's no physical evidence, no DNA, no bruises. That should be in your favor, right? But we've prosecuted cases with even less. The jury tends to believe a crying woman over a man who says, I didn't do it. Eric felt his stomach drop.
You can't be serious. That's not justice.
It's how the system works, the detective said bluntly. You'd better start thinking about your defense. Eric slumped back in the chair, his mind spinning. How had everything unraveled so quickly? How had a simple act of kindness led to this?
Chapter 5. Eric's Trial and Conviction.
Eric's trial was a spectacle from the moment jury selection began. The media had caught wind of the case, and while it wasn't national news, it was enough to stain his reputation beyond repair. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and members of the public eager to witness the downfall of a supposed predator. The prosecution wasted no time painting Eric as a calculating predator who had exploited Madison's vulnerability. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman with a commanding presence, delivered her opening statement with a tone of righteous fury.
This case is about a woman who trusted someone, and that trust was shattered. Eric Calloway saw an opportunity and took it, leaving Madison Carter to pick up the broken pieces of her life.
When Madison took the witness stand, the tension in the room was palpable. Her hands shook as she gripped the sides of the wooden podium, her voice quivering just enough to tug at the jury's emotions.
I was terrified.
She said, her lips trembling.
I told him no. I begged him to stop. But he wouldn't. I remember closing my eyes and just wishing it would be over.
Her tears fell at precisely the right moments. Her distress and unspoken condemnation of Eric. The jury watched her intently, some nodding along sympathetically. The prosecution reinforced her testimony with character witnesses, friends of Madison, who claimed she had been emotionally shattered since that night. Colleagues who testified that she had trouble concentrating at work. It was a carefully constructed narrative, and it was working. Eric sat still, his hands clenched under the defense table, his jaw tight as he listened to the lies being spun. His lawyer, a middle-aged public defender with thinning hair and an overburdened caseload, struggled to mount an effective defense. He pointed out the lack of DNA evidence, the absence of bruises or torn clothing, the inconsistencies in Madison's timeline. There is no forensic evidence linking my client to this crime. This case is based on nothing more than an accusation, he argued. But the prosecution was prepared.
Victims of sexual assault don't always have physical injuries, the prosecutor countered. And trauma can make memories fragmented. Does that mean her pain is any less real? Does that mean she should not be believed?
The jury nodded, absorbing every carefully curated argument. When Eric took the stand, his voice was steady, but filled with frustration.
I drove her home because she asked me to, he said. There was no force, no coercion. I never touched her. I don't know why she's lying.
The lead prosecutor, an experienced female with graying hair and a ruthless courtroom reputation, rose from her seat. She paced for a moment before stepping forward, adjusting her glasses.
Mr. Calloway, you say you simply gave Madison a ride home?
That's right,
Eric replied, gripping the witness stand.
And yet she alleges that you forced yourself on her.
The lawyer continued, her voice slow and deliberate.
Are you saying she just made this up out of nowhere?
Eric exhaled sharply.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
The lawyer nodded thoughtfully before turning back to the jury.
So, you claim that Madison Carter, an educated young woman with no criminal history, no prior false accusations, and no apparent reason, decided to ruin your life just for fun?
Eric's mouth went dry.
I don't know why she's doing this, but I swear I didn't touch her.
The lawyer leaned forward.
You didn't touch her? So why did her neighbors hear her sobbing when she returned home that night? Why did she immediately tell her boyfriend and go to the police? Are you implying she orchestrated all of that as part of some elaborate lie?
I don't know,
Eric stammered. The lawyer smirked slightly, sensing weakness.
Do you think victims of sexual assault always fight back? That they always bear bruises? Or is it possible that some victims are too frightened to resist?
Eric shifted uncomfortably.
I never put her in that position.
But you were alone with her? You were in your car with her? And now, the jury has to decide whether to believe you or the crying woman who took the stand yesterday.
Eric swallowed hard.
Yes.
No further questions,
The lawyer said, walking back to her seat with a knowing glance at the jury. The damage had already been done. The jury had seen Madison cry. They had heard her pain, and in the eyes of the public, a woman's accusation carried more weight than a man's denial. They deliberated for less than 4 hours. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Eric felt his world collapse around him. The words echoed in his ears, drowning out everything else. He barely registered the judge's voice as the sentence was handed down. Eric Calloway, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in state prison. The moment the gavel struck, Eric knew. It was over for him. Eric's world shattered. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in prison. His name was forever tainted, his freedom stolen. And Madison? She walked away unscathed, never looking back. But Eric never forgot, and he never forgave. Eric spent 7 years in a maximum security prison. 7 years of lost time, rotting away, surrounded by men who wanted to tear him apart. He had entered as a quiet, thoughtful man. He had left as something else, something harder, colder. Then, 7 years later, he was released on parole, still branded a monster, A predator. A man guilty in the eyes of the world. Chapter 6. The Fight for the Truth. The first few weeks of Eric's release from prison were a blur of rejection, isolation, and an overwhelming sense of injustice. No one wanted to hire an ex-convict, let alone one branded a sexual predator. His only option was to do poor, paying odd, auto repair jobs. An irony that didn't escape him, considering how one car ride had destroyed his life. But Eric wasn't just trying to survive. He was hunting for proof. Something, anything, that could prove Madison had lied. His public defender had been overwhelmed with cases, underfunded, and lacked the resources to properly investigate during the trial. They hadn't even considered looking for surveillance footage from that night. No investigator had been hired. No witnesses had been cross-checked beyond basic questioning. Eric had been convicted on words alone. Determined, Eric started retracing his steps. He visited the place where the party had been held, questioning staff members and asking if any security footage remained. Most places didn't keep recordings that long, but luck was on his side. The facilities manager, an older man named Joe, vaguely recalled the police asking for footage when the case first broke. However, no one had ever come back for it. "We keep external camera footage archived for a couple of years," Joe explained. "Mostly in case of liability stuff. I doubt anyone even looked through it." Eric's pulse quickened.
Do you still have it?
Joe hesitated, but eventually nodded. "I can pull it up, but you better have a damn good reason." The footage was grainy, but clear enough. It showed Madison drinking, laughing, and chatting with other partygoers throughout the night. It showed her approaching Eric willingly, engaging him in conversation, and even kissing him briefly, before walking toward the exit together. It even showed her opening Eric's car door and getting into the passenger side, on her own accord. Eric clenched his jaw. This was it. Proof that she had lied, at least about how she got into the car. But he needed more. He turned his attention to his own car. He had been driving for Vber back then, and every ride was recorded on his dash cam. A precaution he had taken after hearing horror stories of false claims made against drivers. His car had been impounded after his arrest and eventually auctioned off. He spent weeks tracking it down, eventually finding it at a used car lot. The new owner, a middle-aged mechanic named Luis, had no idea the car had once belonged to a convicted felon. When Eric explained what he was looking for, Luis agreed to check if any old data remained on the dash cam storage. To Eric's astonishment, the files hadn't been wiped. The footage showed the entire car ride. Madison willingly getting into his car. Their conversation, her chatting casually, thanking him for the ride. The moment they arrived at her apartment, her exiting the vehicle with a smile, telling him,
Thanks, Eric. You're a lifesaver.
no force, no coercion, no assault. This was more than just proof. This was an airtight alibi. With both pieces of evidence in hand, Eric took them to an independent lawyer, one who specialized in wrongful convictions. The legal battle ahead would be tough. Overturning a conviction wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, Eric had hope. Madison had walked away from what she had done, but now The truth was clawing its way back to the surface. And this time, Eric wouldn't stop until justice was served. Chapter 7. The Setup. Madison had carefully curated every aspect of her life, and she wasn't about to let Eric ruin it. When she first heard rumors that he was digging into the past, retracing the steps of that night, she dismissed it. What could he possibly do now? His conviction had been sealed, his reputation destroyed. But when she learned he had actual video evidence, irrefutable proof that she had lied, panic set in. She had been at dinner with friends when an anonymous email arrived in her inbox. The subject line alone made her blood run cold. "You thought you got away with it." Her fingers hovered over the screen, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. Who had sent this? It couldn't be Eric. If he had this footage, he would have gone straight to the police, not played games with cryptic emails. She swallowed hard, her mind racing through possibilities. A reporter? Someone connected to Eric? Or worse, someone who had known all along and had been waiting for the right moment to expose her. A single video attachment. She tapped play with trembling fingers. There she was, clear as day, laughing, drinking, fully in control at the party that night, and then leaving Eric's car with a smile on her face. The timestamp in the corner confirmed it. Her stomach twisted as she watched her own image lean flirtatiously against Eric at the party, whispering something into his ear before grabbing his hand. Then, the second video. Her climbing into Eric's car willingly, smiling, thanking him as he dropped her off safely at her apartment. No force, no struggle, no fear. Her breath hitched as a wave of nausea washed over her. She lurched from the table, nearly knocking over her wine glass as she bolted to the restroom. The walls of the upscale restaurant bathroom seemed to close in on her. Her reflection in the mirror, a pale, wild-eyed version of herself. She had to think. Fast. Who else had seen this? She gripped the sink, her knuckles white. Was this just a warning? A threat? Or was the sender preparing to release it publicly? If this footage surfaced, everything would crumble. Her job, her reputation, her carefully constructed victimhood. She couldn't let that happen. Eric was going to destroy her. She had built a career, a reputation. She had turned herself into a victim and reaped every advantage from it. If this got out, she wouldn't just lose everything. She could face charges herself. She needed to act fast. Eric had to be stopped. Chapter 8. The Hit and Drive Away. Madison spent days meticulously planning her next move. She had one advantage. Eric didn't know she was aware of his evidence. He was still playing fair, trying to go through legal channels. He had no idea what she was capable of. Eric read the message 3 times, his jaw tightening with each pass. His hands clenched around his phone, his knuckles turning white. How the hell did she get his number? He had changed it after leaving prison, ensuring no connection to the woman who had ruined his life. The restraining order she had placed on him, the audacity of it, meant she was supposed to avoid contacting him at all costs. So why now? His first instinct was to delete the message, to ignore whatever scheme she was trying to pull. His body tensed with the familiar bitterness that came every time he thought of her. 7 years stolen. 7 years where his name had been synonymous with something monstrous. And now she wanted to talk? His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he started typing.
You've got some nerve. After everything you put me through, you actually think I'd meet you. You should be in a cell, not playing whatever sick game this is.
He hit send. His heart pounded as he stared at the screen, waiting. A response came almost immediately.
I know you have proof. You think I don't know? You think I haven't seen it? But you're wrong, Eric. You don't know everything, and if you want to, you'll meet me.
A cold chill ran down his spine. She knew? That didn't make sense. He hadn't gone public yet, hadn't spoken to the media or the police. His lawyer hadn't leaked anything either. The rage inside him simmered, warring with caution. If she knew, was this a setup? Another false accusation waiting to happen? He could already see the headline, "Exonerated Rapist Harasses Victim." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing his small apartment. He had the proof. He had video evidence that would destroy her. But something gnawed at him, an unease that wouldn't leave. If she was desperate enough to reach out, what was she planning? Finally, he made his decision. If she was going to try something, he needed to be prepared. He wasn't walking in blind. He would record everything. He would make sure whatever happened at that bar couldn't be twisted into another nightmare. At 8:30 p.m., he grabbed a small voice recorder, tucking it into his jacket. He left his apartment and got into his car, driving with caution. His paranoia only grew as he neared O'Malley's. What if she had someone waiting for him? What if this was an ambush? His grip tightened on the wheel. Not this time. By the time he pulled up across the street, his pulse was hammering. He parked but didn't get out immediately, scanning the area. The streetlights cast eerie glows on the wet pavement. The bar's neon sign flickered. Half of the letters burned out. The place looked quiet, but that didn't mean anything. He checked his phone one last time. No new messages. No indication of what was coming. Taking a deep breath, Eric opened the door and stepped out. He never saw it coming. Madison was already at the meetup location. She had been there since 8 o'clock. She didn't go inside. Instead, she waited across the street in her car, watching the entrance like a predator stalking its prey. The dim glow of streetlights cast eerie shadows on the cracked asphalt. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel, nails digging into her palm as she fought off the nausea bubbling in her stomach. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head. The precise timing, the exact speed, the clean getaway. It had to be perfect. At exactly 8:58 p.m., her pulse spiked when she spotted him. Eric walked down the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. He looked cautious, suspicious, but still believing, still thinking this would be a conversation. He paused outside the bar in the empty parking lot. He pulled out his phone. She imagined he was checking for a text, a confirmation that she was inside waiting for him. That was when she hit the gas. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. The world seemed to slow as she crossed the distance between them in mere seconds. Eric turned at the last moment, his face contorting in horror. But there was no time to react. The impact was brutal. His body slammed against the hood with a dull, sickening thud. His face hit the windshield, cracking the glass in a spiderweb pattern. Blood splattered across the glass as the force sent him tumbling over the roof before his limp form crashed onto the pavement behind her. Madison let out a strangled gasp, her breath ragged, her fingers trembling violently around the wheel. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her ears ringing from the deafening silence that followed. She couldn't stop. She pressed the gas harder, the car jerking forward as she fled the scene. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. She could still hear the impact replaying in her head, the dull crunch of bones breaking, the way his body had twisted unnaturally before disappearing from view. Her stomach lurched. She gritted her teeth and swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She needed to get home. She needed to wipe this away, pretend it had never happened. But as she sped through the darkened streets, a satisfying realization clawed its way into her mind. There was no way he survived. There was no one else outside, so no one saw the accident. She had scoped out this area, and there were no cameras. Her hands tightened on the wheel. She had gotten away with it. Madison's breath came in fast, euphoric gasps. As she weaved through the streets, her hands slick with sweat against the wheel. She had done it. She had erased him. A manic, breathless laugh escaped her lips, but she barely heard it over the roar of the engine. She wasn't paying attention to the road. The curve came out of nowhere. A sharp, winding turn along the mountainside. The guardrails rusted and weak. The moment her tires hit the bend, she knew she was going too fast. She slammed the brakes. The tires screeched in protest, but momentum was against her. The car swerved wildly, fishtailing, the headlights illuminating the abyss beyond the cliff's edge. Time slowed as the car's front wheels lifted off the road. Gravity shifted. Madison's scream barely left her throat before the vehicle pitched forward, plunging into the darkness below. The last thing she saw was the shattered windshield, reflecting her own horrified face before everything went black. Chapter 9. Who is this driver? Now, 3 years after Madison's hit and run, we see Madison sitting in the back of this black Vber. She went back to thinking about the Vber she was in and the driver. She had already noticed the little details. The way the rearview mirror tilted just enough so the driver could watch her. The way his hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, like he was bracing for something. And then she listened to him hum again. A deep, eerie tune that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Her stomach dropped. She knew she had heard that tune before. Madison's blood turned to ice. As Madison was going down memory lane in her mind, somehow this driver knew. She stared at his reflection in the mirror, heart hammering.
Hey, can you just drop me off at the next corner?
No response. Her throat tightened.
I said, can you...
The car locked from the inside. Her breath hitched. The driver finally spoke, voice calm, steady.
You don't remember me, do you, Madison?
She went rigid. Her mind screamed at her to deny it, to act confused, but something about his voice. It wasn't possible.
Who are you?
She whispered. The driver let out a low chuckle.
You know exactly who I am.
She grabbed the door handle, yanking, pulling, but it wouldn't budge. Her panic surged.
Let me out, you psycho.
You ran me over.
She froze.
You think killing a man erases him?
His grip on the wheel tightened.
Do you think your lie gets to stay buried?
Her head spun. Her stomach lurched. She had killed him. So how the hell was he driving this car? She clawed at the window, screaming, pounding her fists against the glass as the city lights flickered past.
This isn't real. This isn't real.
The driver smiled, and then the world collapsed.
Chapter 10. The Discovery.
A deafening crash. Madison's body lurched forward, her head slamming into something hard. And then nothing. Blackness. 6 months later. A slow beeping sound. The world flickered back into focus, but something was wrong. Madison was lying in a hospital bed, wires and tubes attached to her. Her head throbbed. Her body felt heavy, sluggish. Madison Carter awoke to the sterile hum of a hospital room, her vision swimming as fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A dull ache pulsed through her body, but the cold weight around her wrists made her pulse spike with panic. Handcuffs. A uniformed officer sat at her bedside, his expression unreadable. Madison Carter, you are under arrest for the murder of Eric Calloway. Her breath caught in her throat, but before she could speak, he continued. You've been in a coma for 6 months, he said, his voice calm but firm. Your car went off a cliff. You were found 50 feet below, still strapped into the driver's seat, your body barely hanging on. He exhaled sharply, leaning forward. It took 3 hours for emergency responders to reach you. The car was mangled, almost unrecognizable. The impact shattered your legs, broke multiple ribs, and fractured your skull. You were lucky to be alive. Madison's mind reeled. A crash. The last thing she remembered was Eric, watching him step toward the bar before she hit the gas. Then, darkness. Your phone survived the wreck, the officer continued, pulling out a plastic evidence bag. We retrieved it during the accident investigation. That's when we found the videos. Madison's blood ran cold. After seeing the videos on your phone, we went to Eric's home. There, Eric had proof of his innocence. The footage from the party, the dash cam recording of you willingly getting into his car, and a voice recording he made before coming to meet you at O'Malley's. A recording where he talked about his suspicions, about how he thought you were setting him up again. The officer's gaze darkened, and then there were the text messages. The ones you sent from a fake email account, pretending to want to make things right. The ones meant to lure him into the perfect trap. Madison's throat tightened.
I don't know what you're talking about.
The officer shook his head. Save it for the trial. We also pulled security footage from the street that night. We don't need visible cameras attached to buildings these days. We have cameras hidden inside the traffic lights. And they showed you speeding away from the scene where Eric's body was found. Witnesses might not have seen the incident, but they heard the impact and saw a fast-moving car drive off. And when paramedics arrived, they found Eric Calloway dead on the pavement. The officer paused before adding, You didn't even check if he was still alive. Madison's breath came in short, desperate gasps. Her hands trembled against the sheets, the weight of reality crushing down on her. She had won. She had gotten away with it. Or so she thought. Now the truth was out, and there was no escape. Her real nightmare had only just begun. Chapter 11. The walls close in. The days in her hospital room blurred together, filled with quiet murmurs of medical staff and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Madison's wrists still bound in handcuffs, her longtime friend and lawyer came to see her. Kate, a woman with steely gray eyes and an expression as unreadable as stone. Wearing a crisp navy suit, the lawyer flipped through a thick case file.
You have two choices, Madison.
Kate said without looking up.
Plead guilty or fight the evidence. But make no mistake, the evidence is overwhelming.
Madison scoffed, crossing her arms.
I didn't do anything wrong.
Kate exhaled sharply and finally looked at her.
Are you serious? Do you understand what you're up against?
She tapped the file with a manicured nail.
The prosecution has dashcam footage of you willingly entering Eric Calloway's car. They have text messages proving you lured him to that bar under false pretenses. They have security camera footage of your vehicle speeding away after you ran him down. And if that wasn't enough, they recovered Eric's voice recording, the one where he said he thought you were setting him up again.
Madison clenched her jaw.
He was a liar.
Kate slammed the file shut, making Madison jump.
No, Madison! You were the liar!
Madison shook her head, her breathing uneven.
That's not true.
Kate leaned forward, her gaze hardening.
You think I don't know you? We've been friends for years, Madison. I know how you operate. You manipulate. You twist the truth until it works for you. But this isn't some petty office drama or a bad breakup you can spin in your favor. This is murder.
Madison's hands curled into fists.
You're supposed to be on my side.
I am on your damn side.
Kate snapped.
That's why I'm telling you the truth. The evidence is airtight. If I weren't your attorney, I'd say you should rot in a cell for what you did.
Madison flinched as if struck.
How can you say that?
Kate ran a hand through Madison's hair. Frustration etched across Kate's face.
Because I believed you, Madison. I stood by you when you accused Eric. I defended you when people doubted your story. And now I have to sit across from you and face the fact that you lied to me, to everyone.
Madison's lips pressed into a thin line.
So what? You're just going to abandon me?
Kate let out a bitter laugh.
Madison, I'm your lawyer. I don't have the luxury of walking away. But I'll be damned if I let you walk into that courtroom unprepared.
She leaned in closer, her voice lowering.
You need to plead guilty. If you fight this, the prosecution is going to tear you apart. I've seen the case they're building. Witnesses, footage, digital records. It's over.
Madison's chest rose and fell rapidly.
I can't go to prison.
Then take the plea.
Kate said firmly.
I can try to get you life without parole instead of the death penalty.
Madison's voice was barely a whisper.
I don't deserve this.
Kate's face twisted with something almost like pity.
Madison, you killed a man. You framed him for something he didn't do. Explain to me how you plan to argue that all of this is some grand coincidence? That the footage, the texts, the digital footprints leading straight to you are all some elaborate conspiracy?
Madison's fingers dug into her thighs.
There has to be a way out of this.
Kate scoffed.
Unless you can bring Eric Calloway back from the dead and have him testify in your favor, No, there is no way out of this.
Madison's face twisted in frustration.
Then why am I paying you?
Because I might be able to get you a plea deal.
Madison's head snapped up.
I'm not pleading guilty.
Kate studied her for a moment, then leaned back in her chair.
Then you'll die. In prison.
A heavy silence fell between them. Madison's breath came in short, sharp bursts, but she refused to accept defeat. She had always been the one in control. Even when Eric had gotten out, even when he had started uncovering the truth, she had taken action. And yet, here she was, trapped, powerless.
Here's what's going to happen.
Kate continued, her voice firm.
If you plead guilty, I can try to negotiate a lesser sentence. Life without parole instead of the death penalty. If you fight this and lose, the jury is going to make an example out of you. You killed a man in cold blood. They will not be lenient.
Madison swallowed hard.
I need time to think.
You don't have time.
Kate stood, gathering her files.
The prosecution has been preparing for months. They're not going to cut you any slack.
She paused at the door.
Decide soon, Madison, because right now, the only thing you have left is the illusion of choice.
The door shut behind her, leaving Madison alone with the crushing weight of reality. For the first time in her life, there was no one left to manipulate, and no way out. Madison's pulse quickened. She thought,
What happens if I fight? Then I go to trial. And if I lose, I may never see the outside of a prison cell again.
Madison's nightmare was far from over. Her hospital routine became a relentless cycle of dull monotony. Every morning, a nurse checked her vitals, avoiding eye contact. The television droned on in the background, news reporters recounting her case in grim detail. Even her own reflection in the small, scratched-up mirror felt foreign. Her face gaunt, her once meticulously styled hair hanging in limp waves. Doctors whispered about her prognosis. The head trauma was severe, but she would recover. The bruises, the broken ribs, those would heal. But the weight of what awaited her outside this sterile room crushed her more than any injury. Then finally, the day she was deemed stable, a prison transport van arrived. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The press was waiting outside, their cameras flashing as she was led into the vehicle. The world wanted blood. And she knew they would get it.
Chapter 12. The trial begins.
The courtroom smelled of old wood and dust, the air thick with tension. Eric's trial was a circus. The prosecution painted him as a predator, a man who had preyed on an innocent woman. Madison sat on the witness stand, her voice trembling, tears spilling as she described a nightmare that had never happened. But in Madison's trial, the narrative was reversed. The prosecution didn't just call her a liar. They dismantled her carefully crafted story piece by piece, exposing every inconsistency, every contradiction. When Madison took the stand, she expected sympathy. She expected to play the victim one last time. But the prosecutor, an experienced litigator with a reputation for tearing through deception, had other plans.
Miss Carter,
He began, pacing in front of the jury.
let's start with the night in question. You claimed, under oath in Mr. Calloway's trial, that you were intoxicated beyond recollection, correct?
Madison nodded, keeping her voice small.
Yes.
The prosecutor held up a printed image. It was a still frame from the party surveillance footage.
Yet here you are, laughing and drinking and partying it up with everyone all night long. Care to explain?
Madison's throat tightened.
I don't remember that.
Convenient.
The prosecutor remarked, setting the paper down.
Now, let's discuss your claim that Eric Calloway forced you into his car.
He clicked a remote, and a video played on the courtroom screen. It was the dashcam footage from Eric's car, showing Madison climbing in willingly, smiling, thanking him for the ride. The jury murmured amongst themselves.
Miss Carter,
The prosecutor continued.
at what point in this footage does Mr. Calloway force you into his car?
Madison's skin burned.
I don't know. I was scared.
You were scared?
He repeated, raising an eyebrow.
Because that's not how it looks. It looks like you willingly got into his car and thanked him, like a normal person accepting a ride home.
Madison gritted her teeth.
That's not what happened.
Then what did happen?
She hesitated too long. The prosecutor turned to the jury.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're seeing a pattern here. First, she lied about her level of intoxication. Now, she's lying about being forced into the car. What else is she lying about?
Over the course of the trial, every witness who took the stand drove another nail into Madison's coffin. Lacey, her former best friend, testified that Madison had called her the morning after the alleged assault, not in tears, but bragging about how much fun she had the night before. A bartender from the party recounted how Madison had been flirtatious and confident, even when she left with Eric. Even Derek, her ex-boyfriend, admitted that Madison's story had changed several times before she went to the police.
Miss Carter,
The prosecutor said, his voice slow and deliberate.
do you know what the penalty is for perjury?
Madison's face went pale.
Because that is what you did.
He continued.
You lied under oath. You fabricated an assault. You sent an innocent man to prison for 7 years, and then you murdered him when he threatened to expose your lies.
Madison's hands trembled in her lap. The jury was no longer looking at her with sympathy. They were looking at her with disgust. By the time the prosecutor rested his case, Madison knew. She wasn't walking away from this. Her lawyer, Kate, fought back, pushing for reasonable doubt. But the surveillance footage, the text messages, the medical records, they were all stacked against her. And then came the worst part. Madison started seeing him, Eric Calloway, or what was left of him. At first, it was just glimpses. A shadow near the jury box. A reflection in the polished courtroom windows. A whisper of his name on the wind when no one else was speaking. Then he grew bolder. One night, alone in her jail cell, she awoke to the sound of humming. That same eerie tune. A shiver crawled down her spine as she sat up, her breath catching in her throat.
You think I'd let you go so easily?
A voice murmured. She turned sharply. He was there, sitting in the dark corner of her cell, his eyes glowing like dying embers.
You're dead?
She whispered, shaking.
I killed you.
Eric smiled, his cracked lips curling in amusement.
Yeah, you did. And yet, here I am.
Madison's sanity frayed as the trial dragged on. Her sleepless nights were filled with Eric's voice, his laughter, his mocking reminders of what she had done.
Did you think you could bury me twice?
He taunted, appearing behind her in the courthouse bathroom, his reflection staring at her in the mirror even though she was alone. She tried to ignore him, to convince herself it was guilt manifesting in hallucinations. But then, the lights flickered, the temperature dropped, and she knew it was more than just her mind turning against her. On the third day of the trial, she broke. Eric stood in the middle of the courtroom, watching. No one else saw him, but she did. Her screams shattered the silence. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but Madison was already on her feet, pointing, crying, pleading.
He's here. He's right there. Don't you see him?
No one did. Her lawyer gripped her arm, hissing in her ear.
Madison, sit down. You're making things worse.
Eric only grinned, mouthing two words.
Not yet.
Madison's trial was no longer just about justice. It was a battle for her sanity. Back under control of her lawyer, Madison sat quietly while the jury was away. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. When the judge and the jury returned to the courtroom, the judge asked them for their verdict. "Guilty," the foreman announced. A wave of noise crashed over the courtroom. Gasps, murmurs, flashes of cameras. Madison's breath caught in her throat. She turned to her lawyer, but there was nothing but resignation in her steely gaze. The judge's voice was final. "Madison Carter, you are sentenced to death by lethal injection." Madison screamed and wailed, but no one listened, and no one cared. Chapter 13. The End. The days leading to her execution blurred together in a haze of dread. The walls of death row were suffocating, the ticking of the clock agonizing. Eric visited her every night.
Almost time,
He whispered.
I'll be waiting.
The night before her execution, she stared at the ceiling, numb, hollow. Then, at exactly midnight, her cell door creaked open. She turned, expecting a guard. But it was him.
Ready to go?
Eric asked, holding out his hand. A chilling realization settled in her bones. This wasn't real. None of it had been real. She hesitated, but her body moved involuntarily, her hand reaching toward his. The second her fingers brushed his palm, the world around her shifted violently. The prison walls melted away like smoke, dissolving into a vast, surreal landscape. Massive black mountains, jagged and lifeless, towered around them, stretching high into the dark sky. Enormous rusted chains draped from their peaks, disappearing into the endless void above. A thick, acrid stench of sulfur burned her nostrils, making her stomach turn. The air shimmered with an oppressive heat, a mist rising from the cracked ground, and as it curled around her skin, she felt it, burning. She gasped, yanking her hand back, but it was too late. The air itself felt alive, searing her arms and neck, leaving an unbearable itch that deepened into a slow, smoldering pain. The temperature climbed with each breath, beads of sweat forming instantly on her skin. Then came the screams. Distant at first, they rolled over the landscape like a storm, echoing through the jagged cliffs. Agonized wails, desperate cries, voices pleading for mercy. The sounds pressed against her skull, suffocating, relentless. She turned wildly, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Where were they coming from? And then she saw them. Figures, human-shaped but twisted, moved among the mountains. Some were bound in rusted chains, suspended over great chasms, their limbs jerking with unseen torment. Others crawled on their hands and knees, flesh burned and peeling, their hollow eyes vacant. And above them, circling in the sky, were creatures, winged, grotesque, their elongated forms twisting unnaturally as they loomed overhead, watching, waiting. Madison staggered backward.
No, this isn't happening.
Her voice trembled, barely audible over the cacophony of suffering around her. Eric stood beside her, eerily calm.
You thought you got away with it.
He murmured, his voice carrying a weight that settled deep in her chest.
But there's no getting away from the truth. Not here.
She turned to run, but the landscape twisted again. The mountains, the chains, the burning mist, all of it blurred and collapsed inward like a dying flame. And in an instant, she was somewhere else. A familiar scent filled her nose. The leather seats, the faint musk of cologne, the low hum of tires against pavement. Madison's heart stopped. She was back in the Vber. The rain drizzled against the city pavement. The neon lights reflected in the puddles. The driver turned, humming that same eerie tune.
Madison?
He asked. She gasped, gripping the seat.
No.
She was back at the beginning, trapped in an endless cycle. Madison's breath hitched, her hands flying to the door handle as she yanked at it, her fingers slipping from the sweat that had broken out on her palms. Her entire body shook with an involuntary tremor, her heartbeat slamming against her ribs like a drum of war. Eric sighed, tilting his head slightly as he watched her struggle.
Come on, Madison. You know how this works by now.
His tone was almost playful, like a teacher explaining a lesson for the 100th time.
Pulling at the handle isn't going to help. It didn't last time, or the time before that, or the time before that.
He smirked, flashing perfect white teeth.
You're persistent. I'll give you that.
Madison's breathing was ragged, wild.
This isn't real.
Eric arched an eyebrow.
Oh, you're catching on faster this time. Maybe we'll break a record.
She turned and slammed her fists against the window, desperate for an escape. The glass didn't even shudder at the impact. It might as well have been steel. Eric tisked.
That's adorable!
Madison whipped her head around, eyes blazing with fury and terror.
Let me out, you psycho.
Eric drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, looking thoughtfully at the road.
No.
She let out a strangled scream.
Why are you doing this?
Eric smiled in the rearview mirror. Eric's eyes locked onto hers.
Did you really think death would be your escape?
Eric's grin widened.
Madison, sweetheart, you did this.
He gestured vaguely to the road ahead, though the scenery had begun to warp. Streetlights stretching unnaturally tall, buildings shifting like mirages.
Actions have consequences, and you just happened to rack up quite the bill.
Her fingers clawed at her scalp.
This can't be happening.
Eric shrugged.
That's what you said last time. And yet, here we are. Again. And again. And...
He snapped his fingers, making an exaggerated boom noise with his lips.
Oh, wait. I think I lost count.
Madison let out a shaky breath, pressing herself against the seat, as if she could shrink herself out of existence. Eric glanced at her again through the mirror, his smile never fading.
Buckle up, Maddie. We've got a long ride ahead. Oh, and before we proceed, I would like to thank you for making this my heaven.
Her screams were drowned out by the hum of the engine as the Vber carried her into the abyss, the trial, the execution, the nightmare. Madison Carter never survived the crash. This was her hell.